Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Last weekend I attended a regional tournament in my home country and I actually came just one game short from winning the whole thing. I played the Sky Striker Orcust deck and I'm gonna show you the deck list. I don't know why they're still giving away those playmats in Europe, but in the end I only top 8 it because I was X and 1 draw when I faced the XO player who actually went 5-0. It was a pretty small regional. I'm still actually disappointed because I really wanted to win it, and I'm gonna explain how I threw the last game of the tournament. But without further ado, let's go straight into the deck list. So, why did I play this deck? Originally I intended to switch to meta decks after the Italian Open, but I was looking for a deck to play at my OTS Championship, which is a tournament that I don't care that much to win. So I was looking for decks that I could build fast, and I started to reflecting about it. Of course I was inspired by the guy who came second at the Berlin Regional, and I found incredible how easy it was to overcome the Snake Eye board going second with this deck, since you are not playing any end traps, which might seem crazy in the current format, but in fact, you are always gonna punish the redundancy of your opponent's hand, and your board breakers are always gonna resolve. Of course, the downside of that is that even the weakest hands of your opponent, which will fall to just one hand trap, will resolve at their full extent, and not only you are gonna face their board, but you also have to counter their non-engines. So if you take a board breaker approach, I think that your main engine has to be strong against hand traps, and you need to rely on those non-engines in order to pretty much resolve their entire board. So I played, of course, free Girsu, which is the main normal summon of the deck and a tool that previously wasn't viable for this strategy, which can be accessed by just Harp Horror. So putting Harp Horror in the graveyard is now a full starter. You don't need to pair it with anything else, so the amount of your starters has increased significantly. And then of course I played the one skeleton with the two Orcust Nightmares. You could play one more skeleton. I decided to cut it in order to play more non-engines. I don't think that the consistency gets decreased by that, because the only time in which this card can act as a starter is if you pair it with Orchestrated Return, assuming that you didn't add any other Orcust monsters, so the percentages are so low that I didn't thought it was necessary. Of course you are gonna cry when you actually are gonna banish it with the Gizmek Orochi. So the last engine cards were of course the Orchestrated Bubble, which is your go-to play for the first turn. I'm not playing Crescendo, not even in the side deck, because if I open with Bubble I value more the chance of drawing more cards, which can lead to more non-engine, rather than playing a card that you never wanna draw going second in a deck that already has bricks, because the Orcust cards in the end, if you are not able to put them in the graveyard, are definitely dead. So I also had the War Wand and the Gizmek, which is another optional card, but having special summons in a deck that, as I said, needs to put those type of cards in the graveyard is generally pretty useful. Also it helps to OTK, it gives you more pushes, it also adds layers to your end board, so I believe it's worth the inclusion. And then of course, as additional starters and cards that enable plays, I use the Warrior package, which consists of one Armageddonite, the one Greffer, which is one of the most important cards because it's a real extender for the deck, the Reinforcement of the Army, which is here to search mainly for the Greffer, but if you really need it, you can also access the Armageddon if you don't really have a way to play in your hand. At first I wasn't playing the Armageddonite because it's just so weak as a normal summon, but it's important to have the option, or even to just add one more card that you can manage with Allure. And then of course we have the Foolish, which right now is the God card, because not only can put your Orcust in the graveyard in order to extend your plays, but it's also a full starter on its own, because you can send the Harp, which can now summon the Girsu and enable a complete play from its own. So that's it for the engine. Those are all our monsters. They're inherently good to play into end traps, pairing them with the spell cards that we are actually playing. There's no Dweller or Lancia in the format, so there's nothing that is gonna prevent you from playing entirely. They're actually decent going second, because just summoning one of them, if you're able to maybe steal one of your opponent's monster, can put an insane amount of pressure, because that alone forces like a dark line which your opponent has to interact with, because if that resolves, you're going to access removals through your extra deck, but if that gets interrupted, you already have another threat, being the Orcust that you put in the graveyard. So This version is the one that benefits the most from having Harp at 3, because we're also playing the free orchestrated return, which of course you are gonna hate and love, because if you draw it without Orcust in your hand, it's completely dead. But when you pair it with Harp or Orcust Nightmare, it's just insane, because it makes your opponent decide if they want to ash it or to let it resolve in order to ash the Orcust that you discarded, but that will also give you 2 additional cards, which usually are more than enough to play. And then I still play the free Allure of Darkness. They're great even going second, because they help you to see your board breakers more efficiently, and it's not a first card that your opponent needs to negate. Of course, I played the Upstart Goblins, which in general are not even that bad to keep even going second. And then one of the best cards in the deck is Engage. Now, this card is not only great because it can draw cards or because it enables a special summon plus basically an interruption, but it's also insane because the cards that it access, even going second, are the ones that you generally need to interact with the Snake Eye board. If you start with it by adding the Shark Cannon, you're gonna banish the Princess from the graveyard, and they don't really have many ways to negate the Shark Cannon, so having such versatility and an immediate out to the Princess, not only for its actual effect of popping a card on the field, but most likely to prevent the Flamberge from hitting the graveyard on your opponent's turn, which means a lot of follow-up and a game really hard to win. It's just a crazy option and something that pretty much any other deck doesn't have, because your actual way to win a game going second against Snake Eye, it's by either flooding them out on their second turn with a card like the Gimmick Puppet, so you can use more than one turn to basically win the game, or the other way, since you're not playing Entraps, is to just prevent the Flamberge from your opponent to actually hitting the graveyard. And you have many ways to accomplish it, but the more important things to do are, as I said, prevent the Princess from resolving and also negate the IP, which is gonna use the Flamberge in order to access an SP. Everything else it's pretty much useless, because just an Harp Horror can kill an Apollousa in the battle phase most of the times, and the next step that you need to fulfill is just to play efficiently around their Entraps and hopefully remove the original Sinful Spoils from the graveyard. So it may seem like a crazy work, but in the end we have tools to do it, because just an SP can banish the original and Typhon can bounce efficiently the Flamberge. Striker cards, of course, I played the Hornet Drones, which is the good old way to make usage of your Harp Horrors or even Nightmares, because if you start with just an access to Hornet Drones and the Nightmare, you're gonna make Agari who's gonna add back the Hornet, and you're gonna pitch the Nightmare with Barricade Board Blocker. And then of course I played the 2 Widow Anchors. The original list played only one, but I think that you run out of striker targets pretty easily if you start with cards like Allure or Return, and it's also a great card going second, so there was no reason to actually play just one copy of it. And then, of course, we have the Shark Cannon, and in my original list I played the 2 Forbidden Chalice, which I'm probably gonna swap moving forward. Those are pretty much going second cards, but can improve your end board pretty easily for when you go first. And then, of course, we have the Call by the Grave, which is also a way to interact with Princess or with the Flamberge itself, plus a card that helps you play when you go first. This deck doesn't really fear your opponent's Entrap unless you open with just one line of play, but has many ways to actually kill them pretty easily, because what you're gonna try to access is just the IP plus Bubble, and everything that you can add to that is just a bonus, like adding Gears on the field, which can prevent the Lightning Storm from a Tempai player. And I also played the 2 Triple Tactics Talent, which are other cards that improve your going first while also having value going second, especially trying to steal an Apollousa. And as last non-engine, which are a high number, as you can see, I played the Forbidden Droplet, which is probably the best card of the deck, because outside of its obvious application, which is negate your opponent's board by putting Orcust monsters in the graveyard, it's also the more versatile card that you can possibly pair your end board with, because if you decide to keep the Ingirsu on the field in order to play around a Ghost Ogre on the IP or a Lightning Storm or anything like that, in those cases you're exposing yourself to your opponent's droplets or impermanence, because at that point you don't have a guaranteed way to put your Dingirsu in the graveyard if your IP doesn't resolve. But if you pair that board with droplet, you can pretty much use them as you want and play around any of your opponent non-engines, so it's great, and sometimes you are also gonna keep a number of them even when you go first after siding. And I believe that's it for the main deck. Now the extra deck is pretty much standard. The only thing I added was a Link Spider, which I believe was a poor choice. The idea behind was that in a regional tournament I am expecting bad decks like Flu, Kashtira and stuff that is generally gonna shifter you. And in those cases, since we no longer have the Linkuribo, when you just summon the Girsu and you can't really put Orcust in the graveyard, you can still access an Spirit all night going with it. Or if you have more tools in hand like Girsu plus Engage, you can make a full IP line. At first I didn't felt like all those cards were mandatory, but the more I play with the deck, the more I realized it. So moving forward, I'm not gonna play it again. I cut the Nightmare Unicorn for it, but it's such a great option and I'm definitely gonna add it back. And the rest, it's pretty much obvious. The Kagari and the Azalea, which are just insane. The craziest thing about the deck is that it doesn't play any card that was released after the 2020, neither in the main or in the side deck, but the extra deck definitely is improved a lot since the time where this deck was viable. This is an immediate push and a card that is threatened by just a normal summon Girsu without using your Orcust in the graveyard. Definitely an insane choice, especially to play against imperms or stuff that your opponent might have in the back row. And then of course the two Galatea. I don't think that you need a third because the games are generally pretty quick right now. The Barricadeborg as another starter in the extra deck. And I played the Dark, and then of course the IP, which is the main card of your handboard. I also played the SP, which I borrowed from a friend. And then I played the Longirsu, which is super important, both in the easiest OTK lines, also to recycle your stuff, and as an additional removal. I feel that by playing this deck more, you're gonna find more usage of it. And then of course the access code, which is super important, even though you're only gonna actually pop one card with it, or two if you start with the Striker engine, but it's still absolutely mandatory. And then I still played that Zeroboros, which is a crazy card, and I'm glad that they played it, because it's like Typhoon, not a card that you can just break down in theory, but when you get to actual real game states, it's just super good, being able to make OTKs without relying on effect resolvings, or just as a blowout in your extra deck. And then the last ones were of course the Dingirsus and the Typhoon, which as I said, it's an important card, especially to remove your opponent's follow-up. The thing about the Nightmare Unicorn is that it enables OTKs through Flamberge, which is something that this deck right now can't really do, because you don't have a real way to remove it from the field when you prevented its effect and still push for the OTK. So I'm definitely gonna put it back, especially for bigger tournaments. Now the side deck was hard to figure out. I didn't want to play those one-offs that I saw in the original list. I wanted something more reliable, and I also wanted to cover a lot of matchups. So I decided to include the Ash Blossom as my only entrap to play against matchups that really get hard by this card, like Labyrinth, Despia of course, and also inconsistent decks like Kashtira and Flu. I'm never gonna put it against Snake Eye because it's way too unreliable and also gives them other plays with Vita. But against the matchups where it can really shine, I'm definitely gonna put it, and it's also insane against Empire, especially when you don't know if they're gonna let you go first or they're gonna start, because being able to negate the Kaiman will put you so much ahead. And then another card that I figured it was worth the inclusion was the Book of Eclipse. It covers both meta decks like Snake Eye, because it basically acts as a Shark Cannon, because by setting the Flamberge they lost the guaranteed way to put it in the graveyard. So in a way it's more copies of one of the most important cards in order to break their board that you still have in 5 copies, counting also the Call by the Grave, but having more it's crucial. And also it's insane against Melodius going second. It's a great card going first against pretty much everything, and it also has this weird benefit of being the best card against Purrely, which is a matchup that you might face. And since this deck was built for a regional where I actually feel like I can win the tournament, so I need to win all the games, it was perfect. But moving forward I might probably include it in the main deck because it has just so much coverage. And then, as going first options, I decided to play the Mistaken Arrest, which is by far the best Floodgate for this deck. It's just insane, I can't explain how good it is. You can resolve it against any single deck of the game, outside maybe Labyrinth, and probably gonna win the game on the spot if you just have a little bit of follow-up plus a board. I was playing also the Dimensional Barrier, but moving forward I did not play it, because you have so many ways to draw cards in your deck, and the rest is just better, because yes, this one will solve some matchups immediately, but I don't want to dedicate that many slots for the going first. And as I said, there's not a single game where you will side the dimensional barrier without want to also draw the mistaken arrest. So moving forward, I just play this card, it is sufficient. And of course I played Rivalry because it's just the best card against Snake Eye, both going first and also going second. You have so many draw cards, actually 12, that you really can access it consistently, and playing with just machines, it's perfectly fine for you, considering that you also have Azalea, which is a machine and another form of removal, and also a card that you can even summon with the IP if you made that setup going first. And then as additional tools I had the Afterburners, which is super important. It's still a going second card and also has the benefits of being basically searchable out to problematic cards like Scale Drain. Of course it's not that reliable, but it's there and it's an option. And I also wanted to try this Sky Striker amp. Of course I had in mind to be able to out the Expurli Noir. You might say that it's not that reliable and you need to keep a Sky Striker monster on the field, but if you have engage, you add the Hornet drones, you summon the drones, you activate Kagari in order to add back engage. If that resolves, even if your opponent sees that you add the amp, they're still forced to interact immediately with your Kagari, so your talents became live. If you didn't add 7 or more materials, now it's no longer unaffected, and you basically solve the matchup just by having this card, even if you are not able to resolve it. And it's also great against Voiceless, because when they have their stuff untargetable and you don't have a huge board breaker like Eclipse, Talent or Droplet, you still have a searchable out to their board, even though it's probably overkill because you still have Dingirsu, Longirsu and other stuff for them. And the last card I played was the time card. I never signed it in, and it's also unreliable because in the end you need to open engage, or you need to use Girsu to go into Azalea and then turn it into Kaina, but you don't really have that many cards that you can just activate for free, because your striker cards are basically engage, which enables this play by its own, Widow Anchor, which you can't activate unless your opponent has previously bestialed you, and the Shark Cannon is pretty much the same. The only ones are drones and engage, but they already given access to Kaina. So that was it for the deck. Now about the tournament itself, we were around 30 players, so 5 rounds of Swiss. In order to win the event you usually need to make 5-0, or at the very least start with 3 wins and 1 draw in order to face the 4-0 on the last round and win it all by defeating him. So I didn't test it as much, but I felt like I had a really good theory. And even though I was a little bit stressed because I slept like 4 hours and we made 3 hours of driving, I was still calm enough. In the first round I faced Melodius. I lost a dice roll. I wasn't that prepared against the matchup. I only knew their basic interactions and what their handboards look like, but I still felt great, because if your hand has some sort of non-engines and you're able to interact with their board, which is usually pretty easy, then you only need to face end traps, because they don't play board breakers or weird cards. So long story short, in the first game I actually overcome its full board. He also had like 1 Imperm, 2 Veilers and an Herald in hand. I was able to somewhat play around them by also resolving a talent with a Droplet, but I made the usual Yu-Gi-Oh player misplay, which is not reading their cards. And when I actually solved their full board and I acknowledged that I couldn't OTK, I didn't realize that Etoile floats when it leaves the field, so in battle phase without a reason I actually kill it, instead of just make the ISP in order to banish their scales and also summon the Typhoon to bounce it. So I started to generate advantage. I was upset about this stupid misplay and I eventually scooped that game. Then in game 2 I won super easy. I also drew the barrier, but in game 3 my opponent was super calm. He didn't want to win in time. He wasn't playing actual barn cards, so we ended up drawing the first match just for that misplay of me actually killing that wall with no reason. But that was still fine, because in the end I was there to try to win the event, and if I won all the next rounds I would have still do it. So from that point I started to focus. In the next round I faced Salamangreat, which is a scary deck right now. I won 2-1, even though I bricked twice in that match, so it was pretty hard. I remember that one game I started with a Forbidden Chalice, a Widow Anchor and a Shark Cannon, which were enough, but I really needed to grind that game, because on the second turn I drew a Gizbek Orochi who banished all my Yarp Horrors, but somehow I was still able to win that game on the grind. And then in round 3 I faced Voiceless, when I believe I played one of my best matches of recent times, because in game 2 I was able not only to overcome its board but also to OTK him, where he started with Skull Guardian plus Slow with the Sauravis and also Ash, Magnamut and the Trap card, which was crazy because I also had something like 4 or 5 cards in hand that I didn't even needed to use. Then on round 4 I faced the same Kash SE of one of my friends, which I also played in the regional in Rome that I reported some time ago. And I won the dice roll. He didn't open with Shifter. In game 2 he made a bold move of let me go first, maybe to catch me off guard with some non-engines, but I summoned a Girsu who also makes a token on its board, and pretty much the matchup was solved just from there. And I got to the last round where I was paired against a Snake Eye Kash SE deck. I won the dice roll, I went first, and I was hit with a Droll Lockbird after I resolved the reinforcement of the army. And then he also had Ash Blossom, Veiler, I believe Ghost Mourner, and he also drew a Fenrir for turn, which I was able to interact with, but I didn't draw extenders moving forward, and he was able to win the grind when he eventually top decked the Snake Eye Ash once I didn't have anything else left. Then we got to game 2, where I was hit with once again a Droll Lockbird, an Ash Blossom, and this time I believe a Bestial or even another Imperm. My handboard was just Dingirsu plus 2 sets, but one of them was Rivalry, so I was pretty confident. And then sadly we got to game 3. Now, at this point there were like 15 minutes on the clock. I was going second, so I didn't felt like that game would have ended in time, since I don't play end traps and he can pretty much make his full board without feeling that much. Although his opening play included Poplar and Diabellstar, which can't play effectively around both Nibiru and also Ash Blossom. But at some point I saw that he was spending a lot of time to actually work around his board. So the clock was starting to tick and I felt like I would have only needed to play my turn, and at that point was actually impossible to lose that game. He ended with a full board, even though he made some weird sequences where he had the Apollousa, he also had the Princess in the graveyard, he had both IP and Flamberge, but both of them were in the spell and trap zones. Of course he had the field spell. He had 4 cards in hand, and I knew that one of them was Poplar. He still had a crazy board with like 8 interruptions, because the 3 cards in hand could be all end traps. Although I have to say that he started with Wanted and the Diabellstar Pitch and Impermanence. So one of those cards was drawn later, and at that point it can easily be another Snake Eye monster or just a double of an end trap that he kept after he resolved the Diabellstar. So I had a crazy hand. Of course I needed to win the game, I couldn't just draw it, because in that case I would have gone 3 wins and 2 draws, and he would have won the tournament with 4 wins and 1 draw. So I only need to make some damage and to clear the more I could, and my hand actually allowed to do it. I had an Orcust Nightmare, a copy of Girsu, I had the return, I had Engage, and I had a Forbidden Droplet, and I also drew another one for turn. So, this is my opening hand. Now, as I said before, if you want to sort out the Snake Eye board, all you gotta do is guarantee to have an interruption for the IP in order to not put the Flamberge in the graveyard, and a direct answer to Princess can also help a lot, not only to prevent their pop, but also once again to prevent their guaranteed follow-up and all those monsters that will come out in defense. Now, if you really think about it, with 6 minutes on the clock and all those options to make, I don't really need to take care of his follow-up. In the end, if he's gonna summon the Princess from the graveyard, unless he really puts me out of resources, I can just play all my cards, slap a Typhon one of my monsters in the end, and just deal some damage and guarantee to prevent the option for him to do the same. But not only that, with this combination you can effectively play around everything, and by also having return or even just droplet, you can also play at the very least around 2 end traps. So at this point, I said to myself, he drew the Droll Lockbird both in game 1 and 2. For sure he's not gonna draw it again in game 3. Now, my first action should technically play around Droll. So, I have 2 options. I can start with return, pitching the Orcust Nightmare, which for some reason was something that I wanted to avoid, even though it was probably so clear, because if he ashes it, at least I don't have to count it later. But if he let it resolve, I'm gonna draw cards from a deck that, at this point, even through a Droll Lockbird, includes something like 24 cards that I'd love to draw, and just 11, which are basically the other copies of Engage, Return, and some Allure or stuff like that I wouldn't like to draw. Or if I just avoid completely this line because I want to prevent as much information as possible from my hand, I can just start with Engage and add literally any of the striker cards outside of the afterburners. For whatever reason, I felt like I really needed to resolve this droplet in order to prevent his IP, and since he had both in the spell and trap zone, I technically wanted to have a guaranteed way to negate both the Apollousa and also the IP that he had in there. Once again, this is just pure madness, because even if his Apollousa leaves, what's it really gonna accomplish? I can still force the IP by just declaring the battle phase with a Girsu on the board, and if he lets it resolve, I'm gonna kill the Apollousa anyways, even if he negates its effect. And also it's way likely that when I actually normal summon a guy, he will trigger the field spell in order to summon back the Flamberge, and at that point with the Forbidden Droplet I can take care of both. Also, by adding the Afterburners, I'm removing a 0 attack monsters from the field, because in any other case, if I had the Widow Anchor, I would have just negated its effect, and if I added the Hornet Drones, I was just complicating the game state, which was more than enough to actually win under those circumstances. So this was genuinely the worst option of my entire deck that I could have chosen. It wasn't playing around anything. By doing so, I was also not countering the Princess, which meant that he would have resolved it eventually, and that Flamberge would touch the graveyard, so giving him a guaranteed follow-up and also monsters, which are great when you have the field spell on the board. I can keep counting reasons why this was just the worst play that I possibly had at this point, but I still somehow managed to do it. So my hand looked like that, and at this point it rolls once again for the third game in a row. So I activated these Afterburners because I really wanted to get rid of this Apollousa, even though, as I have explained, had literally no sense. The main reason why I decided to add it was that if he didn't have a Droll and Lockbird in hand, I could have followed by activating the Return, pitching the Nightmare, and that would already put 2 spells in the graveyard. So with just any other spell that I could possibly activate, these Afterburners would take care of both the Apollousa and also the field spell without needing to actually put a monster on the field for him to trigger it. But once again, he would never play the round droplet on that spot, because he also needed to have the Flamberge on the board for his princess to be alive. So that was just craziness, and I can't even say that I was under pressure, because I felt really relieved when I saw that there was just 6 minutes, and I was literally 1 game away from winning the event. Instead, none of this happened. What I did was adding these Afterburners, popping his Apollousa, and then I followed by normal summoning the Girsu. He allowed it to resolve, so I sent an Harp Horror. I activated the Harp Horror effect. He hashed it. I was still completely fine. He chained the field spell to Girsu to summon his Flamberge, which was something that he would have done even if I didn't remove the Apollousa. So not only at this point he had a big monster on the field and the princess live in the graveyard, but in order to keep playing I was forced to use the droplet immediate and not in response of either IP or Flamberge. So I was forced to pitch this Orcust Nightmare, and at this point I was still completely fine, even through his Apollousa, Princess, Ash Blossom, and also the Droll and Lockbird that he had on all those games. Because this Nightmare could have Sand Wand, who also would have summoned back the Harp Horror. I had the token from Girsu, so I had so many bodies that I actually could have deal a lot of damage and also get rid of most of his follow-up through SP and also Typhon. But at this point he also had the worst possible card for me that he could have drawn, which was the Bestial Druiswurm. So his handboard was Apollousa, IP, Flamberge, Princess, with also Ash, Droll and Druiswurm in hand, one of them drawn by Wanted later in the turn, which could have been literally any Snake Eye card or even just another Ash Blossom or another Droll and Lockbird. But even then, by just adding a Shark Cannon with Engage and using this droplet to negate the Apollousa and eventually the IP or the Flamberge, I would have played through all of that, because I only needed to deal so few damage. I also used the Girsu effect to summon a token, and it decided to chain the Princess. So I just slapped the Typhoon, I attacked the Princess. I still had those 2 cards in hand, but since he specifically drew Druiswurm, even if he only had 20 seconds left, when he entered the battle phase with just 2 Snake Eyes in attack, I couldn't prevent him by any mean, and I just lost the game on the spot. I could keep explaining how bad it was and how stupid I felt the moment I realized what I did. In the end, it just came to not having much testing, but this share cannon interaction is so obvious that I really felt bad for it. Nothing would have changed. I've already won a regional in my home country, but when you play this game you actually do it for the glory. And also was so cool to have a deck from the 2019, and the story is made only by the winners, and in this case I felt like I had a great story to tell, and instead I'm just here saying that I came in 5th place in this regional because I ended with a 3-1-1 record. So it was still a great tournament. I'm glad that I played this deck, and I actually do believe that if you played it correctly, it might be one of the best decks to actually incorporate a board breaking approach into the meta game. So I suggest you guys to actually give it a shot. I hope you guys enjoyed this deck profile and also the report. That's it for today, and see you guys in the next one.